This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek in Pacifica, and the continuing genocide going on in Gaza and the West Bank has led to a growing anger among workers around the world, including in the United States. And recently, there's been a call by the General Federation of Trade Unions of Gaza to call on the workers of the United States to take action in solidarity with the Palestinians and against the genocide. And joining us today is Michael Letwin. He is a lawyer, former president of his UAW Local, and also one of the co-founders of Labor for Palestine. Welcome to our show.
Thanks,
Michael.
Steve. Great to be here, as always.
So, Michael, first of all, why don't you talk about the work you've been doing and your fight in the union to get the union involved, as well as Labor for Palestine?
Well, Labor for Palestine began in 2004, so it's over 20 years now. And really, the whole point has been to uphold the call from Palestinian trade unions for solidarity against Zionism. And that includes, of course, support for BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, especially in the labor sphere. And it really builds on and tries to reaffirm the work that began in the late 60s and early 70s in the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and the Arab Workers Caucus in the UAW, both of which in Detroit, who brought the issue of Palestine to the UAW. Because the UAW, the Auto Workers Union, for decades, really going all the way back to the Nakba of 1948, has been a major supporter of Zionism, has bought who knows how many millions of Israel bonds. And that really was the issue in 1973, during the 73 war, when Arab workers and Black workers in Detroit went on strike and held protests. In that situation, not against the company, although if they were against the companies, but against the international UAW and the local 600 leadership, which owned Israel bonds and demanded that those Israel bonds be sold. And so you had many Arab workers, in fact, in those plants who were leading that charge, with the support of Black workers, with the support of a lot of white workers and other workers. And so that's what we're trying to build on, is that legacy of anti-Zionism, really anti-labor Zionism in the workplace, in our unions. And so we formed Labor for Palestine in 2004 to make sure, or to fight, to make sure that Palestine was not ignored or sidelined or excluded by the post-9/11 anti-war movement, which many of us were involved with. And also to make sure that we were bringing this fight to labor, within labor, to demand that labor uphold the basic principles of solidarity. An injury to one is an injury to all. We don't cross picket lines, we walk picket lines, and to make that apply just as much to Palestine as anything else. So that's the history of Labor for Palestine and how we began. And then in the last 20 years, we've pursued those efforts and supported all kinds of rank and file work, because we are a rank and file based caucus, or rather a union oriented organization. And we also have, many of us in the UAW have continued to fight within the UAW around the issue of Palestine.
And of course, the AFL-CIO from its beginning supported Israel. They work with the Histadrut. And what is the Histadrut? Because that union says it represents the workers in Israel, but in reality, it has quite a different history.
Right. The Histadrut was the Israeli state in waiting, meaning that all the way from its founding in about 1920, it was used by Zionist movement to essentially create the ground for the establishment of the Israeli settler colonial state. And they did that by calling themselves a labor federation, even though they were at that point exclusively, and they discriminated against the indigenous workforce. Their whole idea was to, quote, conquer land and labor, meaning take away the land from Palestinians and exclude Palestinians from the work. And that's the history of the Histadrut all the way up through 1948. It played a major role in the Nakba. And then it helped to run the Israeli state for the next 30 years while the Labor Party was in office. So it really is at the heart of the Zionist project, and has nothing to do with the kind of the labor federation that we would think of in this country. I mean, of course, we have problems with our labor federations, the AFL-CIO and so forth, but at least they are labor federations. However, backward they may be, or even compromised politically, which they are, including their support for Zionism. and lots of other bad things, but nonetheless a labor federation still. This is the Histadrut has more in common with, say, a white workers' union in South Africa under apartheid, when you had the same kind of colonial settler state, which had a very active white so-called labor, unions for white workers only, but which was completely complicit in the apartheid regime. And that's what the Histadrut is in Israel. What we call, we say all of Palestine, all of Israel is occupied Palestine. So when I say Israel, I don't mean a place or a people. I mean the regime that occupies Palestine
And of
and
course,
has since 1948.
the history was involved, I understand, in supporting the apartheid regime in South Africa and
Yes.
supporting Buthelezi, and working with the AFL-CIO to fund Buthelezi and Inkatha, which would then attack trade unionists who were organized in South Africa and COSATU, independent trade
Well,
unions.
even worse than that, I mean, the thing that's the other thing about Histadrut is that they have also been an employer. So they've owned lots of factories, including weapons factories in Israel. And they through that process and through the Labour Party government, which was then in power in the 70s, helped South Africa, gave South Africa essentially apartheid South Africa nuclear weapons. And because Israel had the nuclear weapons, and they made a deal to do that for South Africa as well, partly for all kinds of reasons, but mainly because they were alike regimes and wanted to make sure that they were pushing back the anti-colonial liberation movements together. And so they were tightly allied under the Histadrut-based Labour government with apartheid South Africa.
And the AFL-CIO has not said that there's genocide going on in Gaza. They have not called for stopping the weapons, U.S. weapons that are going to support that genocide. And in cases like in the San Francisco Labor Council, Liz Schuler, the president of the AFL-CIO, actually sent a letter saying you shouldn't even talk about the issue of Palestine. This effort to build solidarity against the genocide and for the freedom of Palestinian workers in Palestine and Israel. What kind of obstacles has the Labor for Palestine faced in that regard?
Well, going back certainly to, the first sort of mainstream labor resolution in support of BDS came out of the UAW Local, which was then 2865, now 4811 it's called, in the University of California, the grad student workers, and now more than just grad students. And at that time, the membership there took a vote, overwhelming landslide vote in favor of BDS. This was during another of the intense attacks on Gaza by Israel, of course, using US weapons. And that vote passed overwhelmingly, and then the international UAW overturned it and nullified it on the grounds that it was inconsistent with UAW support for Israel. That was under the old regime, the old administration caucus regime in the UAW, which was in power for something like 70 years, and which has now been replaced, to some degree, has been replaced by the election of Shawn Fain, who's the current UAW president, who came in on a reform slate. But those are the kinds of obstacles that we faced all the way through. That is, attempts by the bureaucracy in many unions and in the AFL-CIO, as you point out, to stifle and overturn and silence solidarity with Palestine. And the slogan, one of the slogans we use is, an injury to Palestine is an injury to all. So they don't get that notion of solidarity, even in regard to many domestic labor issues, and they certainly don't get it or apply it or practice it when it comes to Palestine or many other places. And so that's been the tradition. Now, since October 7th of 2023, there have been the emergence, I would say, of two different types of breakage with that. There's the sort of the top-down breakage coming out of what you could call the ceasefire unions. 7 international unions that came out for ceasefire and also ultimately for arms embargo against Israel. And that's a good thing. On the other hand, there's been built-in problems with even that, because on the one hand, there's the language of much of those resolutions has been very equivocal in regard to the liberation of Palestine. And in addition to that, those unions, unfortunately, have stuck to talk and not much to walk. So there's been some good talk, but there's been virtually no implementation of any of those things. And so, for example, in the UAW, the International continues to own Israel bonds. And we in UAW Labor for Palestine, which is a branch of the National Labor for Palestine National Network, has fought for and demanded since October of 2023 and before for those bonds to be divested. And the International, even under Shawn Fain, has refused to do that. So you've got this contradiction between Shawn Fain coming out rightly and to his credit in support of the student protesters, the student intifada, the student encampments demanding disclose, divest, we will not stop, we will not rest when it comes to university investments in Israel, but not applying the same principle to the UAW's own ownership of Israel bonds. So that's what you have not only the top-down picture that I'm describing of these unions, but also a rank and file approach, which is the Labor for Palestine approach. We've always been about grassroots, rank and file based demands and action. Because with the Palestinian trade union, and this comes to the question of the most recent and Palestinian trade union call, because with the Palestinian trade unions, especially in Gaza, have continually said to us over the decades, but especially since October of 2023, is we appreciate your resolutions, we appreciate your conferences, but words are not enough to stop the genocide. And we're urging you under the bombs as they fall on us. And who knows how many tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of Palestinian deaths and casualties since October of 23. We are appealing directly to U.S. labor, as they did for their recent May Day statement, to take action, to go beyond words and take action. And that's what Labor for Palestine is trying to do. Not because we have the power as Labor for Palestine on our own to take action in that regard, but rather to organize and urge that kind of action, especially from the rank and file, and to have the rank and file also hold our union leaderships accountable. And that's why groups like UAW Labor for Palestine or UE folks in the UE, which has been one of the most progressive unions, but again, has not put its money necessarily where its mouth is, especially when it comes to endorsing pro-genocidal candidates like Biden in the last election. In SEIU, another one of the ceasefire unions, but we have in all these unions rank and file groups that are affiliated with Labor for Palestine National Network to go beyond and to support the efforts in places like ILWU Local 10 in Oakland, which has refused, for example, to handle Zimline cargo, the Israeli Zimline cargo, for the last 10 years or more, and has kept that cargo more or less from appearing on the West Coast. So that's the approach that we have, and that's what we're trying to answer, are the Palestinian trade union calls for deeds, not just words.
And of course, the increasing attack on UAW members, graduate students, the police raids, the attack even on a lawyer who's representing people who have been attacked. It seems like these fascist attacks, and as combined with the termination of the contract with TSA, the union busting, direct union busting against workers' rights to organize, the destruction of the NLRB, the destruction of any process. I know the UAW had big plans to organize in the South through the NLRB. I mean, they're not going to be having elections. The frontal attack on organized labor, you would think that there would be a mass movement and a call in the UAW and other unions to mobilize the entire working class on May Day against these attacks and combine it with the attack on workers around the world.
Right, exactly. And I think what's happened in the UAW to some degree is that you don't hear much at this moment from the International. Before the election, you had Shawn Fain calling Trump a union buster, and of course supporting Biden and Harris, or Biden and then Harris. And we in UAW Labor for Palestine called them out on their support for those genocidal candidates. And some of our members were actually dragged out of a political action conference at the UAW in January of 2024, who were heckling Biden for his being a war criminal. And they were dragged out by Secret Service with the applause of many of the delegates at the UAW. So yes, I mean, but at least before the election, Fain and the leadership was calling out Trump for what he was. And that actually is no longer the case, at least at this moment. The UAW leadership seems to have endorsed Trump's tariff policy, even though that's destroying the economy. it's putting auto workers, unionized auto workers, and many others out of work already, because of course that trade wars are going to do that.
That's what they do.
And
Trade wars hurt the working
right,
class.
trade wars hurt the working class, and not only that, but they also have a nasty way of becoming, real wars. I mean, that's part of what led to World War II, right? With trade wars of the 30s. So, you have that. None of that's good for workers. But on top of that, as you point out, the frontal assault on workers, on labor, on immigrants, on everybody, pretty much, except for the billionaire class. And even some of them aren't happy with the tariffs for their own nasty reasons. Is really meeting very little organized resistance at this point. And so I think, as you've often pointed out, Steve, and we certainly agree with in Labor for Palestine, the need to generalize this resistance and to show how these things are connected, to show, for example, how the attack on the Palestine Solidarity Movement and the Gestapo raids that are taking place against immigrants and graduate students and other kinds of workers who are not in universities, of course. They picked up the head of one of the farm worker unions recently and snatched him, and he's now in custody. So Layla. So this kind of thing is one big picture. And of course, the attack on the universities by the Trump the regime is being done under the guise of fighting, quote, anti-Semitism, by which they mean opposition to Israeli genocide. So all these things are inextricably connected. There's no way to separate these things. And yet what we're seeing is one, very little resistance being organized. It was good that there was a hands-off demonstrations last on the 5th. I guess that was still last weekend, around the country. And apparently I saw something like 600,000 people were reported in DC, and that's great. But at the same time, they're not the leadership of those demonstrations refused to mention Palestine, refused to make those connections. And that isn't to say that they shouldn't have been supported, the demonstrations, or that it wasn't important to be there. And the people that went and participated, of course, many of them support the Palestine Solidarity Movement, perhaps the overwhelming majority even. But the leaderships there, dominated by the unions, the leaderships of the unions and the Democratic politicians made sure that that was not, allowed.
Well, also, they left out military spending. I mean, there are trillions
Yes.
of dollars, and NATO. They supported NATO.
Yes, they supported NATO, right?
And they left out trillions of dollars which are going to the military. In fact, Trump wants to increase the military budget to over a trillion now. And that money is coming out of housing, healthcare, education. So to leave that out leaves out what the US capitalists and imperialists are doing, which is let's expand the military and build up the military for war with China and other
Yes,
countries while we're attacking
exactly.
working class here. And the other thing about Trump and Musk and the fascist the J.D. Vance is that they actually want to destroy public universities. The attack on NIH, they want to liquidate the public universities as we know them in Project 2025 and privatize them and bust the unions. And they are carrying that out. Isn't that their plan for public universities?
Yeah, I mean, as everybody says, or is often said, Project 2025 tells exactly what they intend to do, and they're doing it. And they're doing it so far with very little resistance. And if we're going to survive this thing, we can't, for example, wait for general strike in 2028, which is what the UAW leadership has been talking about. I mean, it'd be great to have a general strike in 2028, but we need a general strike in 2025 so
If
that
their
we're
unions
around in
left,
2028.
if their unions left in 2028, if you
Yes,
wait,
exactly. Right. And the UAW, I mean, for example, has already been in decline for decades and decades. I mean, when I first, was aware of the UAW in the late 60s and early 70s, it had over 1 million members. Now it has a few 100,000 members. Now, a lot of that has to do with deindustrialization, but a lot of it has, to do with the failure of the leadership, not just of that union, but of all the unions, pretty much, to really organize and to defend, their unions, our unions. And being in bed with the Democrats instead of organizing real resistance. And now more than ever, if we don't organize resistance now, I mean, we're living in, as somebody put it, we're living in a mafia state here. I mean, that's another way of describing what it is, right? It's just a gang, a bunch of gangsters up there, more than ever before, perhaps. in control, and they are doing everything. They're not just attacking public universities, they're attacking private universities. They're not just attacking private universities, they're attacking every single agency of the government that plays a good role, unlike the military, which of course they're promoting, and the Gestapo state essentially that they're building and that they've unleashed. The snatchings. I mean, it's like Argentina or Chile, or I mean, of course, this has happened before in this country. It's not like it's unprecedented. It happened in the Palmer raids, in the late teens of the last century. The first Red Scare. I don't know if it's the first Red Scare. Maybe the first Red Scare was, the Haymarket martyrs. But anyway, they had that. Then they had the mass roundup of like 5,000 people were deported during the Palmer raids for being leftists and communists and radicals, socialists, anarchists. And then they did it in the 50s. And now they're using those same laws to do it today. And so, we're gonna if we don't hang together, we're gonna hang separately more than ever before.
And this idea that if you're critical of Israel, you're an anti-Semite. I mean,
Right.
that whole idea. I mean, isn't it the case that the Zionists actually work with the Nazis? They invited Adolf Eichmann to Palestine to get him to support the idea of a Jewish state, and yet now, if you criticize Israel, you're an anti-Semite, including the thousands of Jews, hundreds of thousands of Jews in the United
Yeah.
States who've been organizing protests.
Well, I think one interesting development is, you've seen articles in the last couple of weeks, for the first time really, that sort of quote more mainstream Jewish people. Not, I mean, not, there's no such thing, right? But I mean, people that otherwise wouldn't have objected before are now objecting to the abuse of so-called opposition to anti-Semitism, the weaponization of anti-Semitism to shut down free speech and to shut down Palestinian solidarity. There's a lot of Jews, increasingly, who are uncomfortable with that notion, with the notion that anti-genocide is anti-Semitic, and also that somehow Jews are going to be in a better position because of repression in the campuses, for example, against free speech, than they otherwise would be. And of course, Jews are not going to be protected by this. And the anti-Semitism that does exist is coming from people in bed with Trump. That's where the anti-Semitism is. It's not in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, as you point out, in which thousands of tens of thousands of Jewish people are involved, sometimes at the cutting edge, or among those at the cutting edge, I should say, rather. We had a demonstration just recently, a number of big demonstrations, including at the U.S. Capitol and in New York City. You see them at Grand Central, where you have hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews coming wearing shirts that say "Stop arming Israel." They did it at the Trump building about a month ago, and a bunch of them were arrested. So, I mean, yes, all of these things, and but so far, at least, obviously the movement has not been silenced, and it will not be silenced. No matter what happens, it will not be silenced. But again, we need to bring this to labor, because bringing it back to that, I think the point is, for those of us who were involved, as I think you were in the Vietnam anti-war movement. One of the things that became clear, if it wasn't already, is that important as student movements are, and they are very important, and they played a really important role then and now. In 1970, in May, almost exactly 55 years ago, this coming month, 1,000 universities and colleges in this country were shut down on strike. But they couldn't bring the war to an end because they didn't have the social weight to do that, important as they were. And this is in no way to denigrate or dismiss what the importance of that was. And I was up there as a junior high school student. I went up to UCLA and I was camped out there for a month with lots of other people. And it was great and it was important. But unless that gets, brought into and through the working class movement, at the workplace, in the unions and so forth, and it began to be, but it wasn't enough. And unless that happens, it's very hard to shut down the kind of stuff that goes on, including the wars that we're seeing. And really, the war ended in Vietnam when the working class and the military, that is the rank and file GIs, mutinied to a point where the war could no longer continue. And unless we're able to replicate those kinds of movements today in the working class, we're going to be faced not only with those for never-ending wars abroad, but the ongoing and never-ending attack on us at home that really, at this point, perhaps is unprecedented in living memory, for sure.
And my union sister, Sarah Nelson, has called for a general strike. Um,
Yes.
and yet it seems there's been silence by the rest of the union leadership, despite the direct frontal attack on union workers, federal workers. Of course, they want to get rid of the public workers, who are a large majority of organized workers. But it seems like within my union, the CWM and the News Guild, there's complete silence about this frontal attack. Instead, they're saying, let's go to the courts, let's file more lawsuits. They're not really saying the entire working class has to be mobilized. You think they're afraid that if they do that, they'll lose control of the rank and file? And that's one of their fears that they have?
I mean, I think it's a couple of things or several things. One is it's not in the DNA of the labor bureaucracy to mobilize the members other than to vote in elections. I mean, that's their focus. They're in bed with the Democratic Party for the most part, and they, they cannot think beyond that. Even these rallies, that AOC and Bernie have had recently, in places like Arizona where they turn out thousands of people against Trump, it's pretty amazing on one level. Yet, in terms of what they have to offer or what they're calling for, it comes down to, go out and vote again for the Democrats. Um, there's nothing wrong with bringing lawsuits. We should bring lawsuits, obviously, to stop these things. But the idea that the courts are going to save us or the Democrats are going to save us, is clearly not the case. And so I think part of it is this baked in DNA that goes all the way back, I mean, certainly, for a century or more, and it, was really cemented during the 30s with the New Deal and all that, and the alliance with the FDR regime. But on top of that, so I don't think that they're also scared. I mean, they're scared in the sense that I think this is what's going on with the UAW leadership is that the whole point of Trump, right, the way that he operates is to make examples of people and institutions so that other people will also shut up. To essentially terrorize people and institutions to do his bidding and to be scared.
And the
And of
UAW
course, there's
does
nothing.
monitorship as well, so they can
Yes, and the
control
UAW
things.
has a monitor for corruption. So, and there's a question about the politics of the monitor on top of everything else in regard to Zionism. So, you know, this is nothing. There's nothing new about this idea of scaring people into silence. I mean, of course, that's went on in the 50s, and it's gone on in lots of situations. But the scale of it, I mean, the sheer restrained nature of the way Trump is retaliating against all his enemies, personal, political, economic, and otherwise, is really almost unprecedented, I would say, in terms of the certainly since maybe in the 19th century that went on more. But I mean, even the fact that there's no restraints whatsoever, and it's not as personal corruption. I mean, they obviously his family made a fortune out of this last few days, right? When they first imposed the tariffs and then they dropped the tariffs, and his family reportedly made a fortune when they knowing that these tariffs were going to be suspended again, so that they could buy low and then sell high if they're even selling. And so nobody's stopping. None of the institutions, right, that are supposed to stop this sort of thing, be watchdogs, be checks and balances, and all that kind of stuff that you learn in civics class. None of that is happening. And so I think that therefore union leaderships like in the UAW are scared. They're thinking, shit, we're going to be next, if we're not already. What if they come after us? What if they try to decertify us? What if they arrest us for who knows what and corruption and this and that, whether it's true or not? And, you know, who, that's, I think, part of what's going on too.
Well, the issue of democracy and membership debate and discussion in my
Yes,
union, impossible. It's all very difficult. The union
right.
conventions are controlled. Also, there's a struggle just to keep this UAW for UAWD alive. They want to shut it down. I mean, it seems like at a time like this, you want more democracy, you want more debate and discussion in the labor movement. Right in the UAW, with the formation of UAWD, that was a vehicle for some discussion and debate, and there's an effort to close it down.
Yeah, and just for those who don't know, UAWD is Unite All Workers for Democracy. It's the rank and file caucus that began a few years ago in the UAW to basically challenge the one-party state that has existed in the UAW all the way back to at least the 1940s, and that was in power for all those decades since, and which saw the decline of the UAW, from over 1 million to less than, much less than that. And also all kinds of other horrible racist, pro-imperialist things. And so UAWD played a critical role in, getting Shawn Fain elected and he has credited UAWD with his election basically, and says, without UAWD, I would not be in office, which is true. But unfortunately, the majority of the current steering committee of UAWD is now trying to demolish it because it appears to them, apparently, that it's too independent from Shawn Fain, that it's too interested in cross connections between white and blue collar workers, because it's too interested in solidarity with Palestine, and too democratically oriented. And so rather than just pick up and leave, which is what they should do, they're actually trying to destroy UAWD, to burn it down. And we have a membership meeting on April 27th where that's going to be fought out. And we're organizing very hard, sort of the left wing of UAWD, the rank and file wing of UAWD, to make sure that that does not happen. But I just want to return for a moment, because I don't want this to get lost in all this information, that, as you mentioned at the very beginning, the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions in Gaza issued a Mayday call on April 4th, just a week ago. And what they're urging US unions to do, and I'm quoting now, is to, quote, go beyond statements and speeches and create real pressure, close quote, including, and this is where the quote that you referenced is, general strikes and widespread civil disobedience, close quote, against the ongoing bipartisan US-backed Israeli genocide in Gaza, and to, quote, coordinate efforts with the student movement, close quotes, against the Trump regime's domestic assault on Palestine solidarity. And so they further go on and say, quote, we in the General Federation of Trade Unions in Gaza address this call to you, and they're speaking directly to US labor here. This is addressed to US unions. Back to the statement, on the eve of the International Workers' Day, affirming that your struggle for workers' rights in the United States is inseparable from our struggle against occupation and colonialism. True labor solidarity is demonstrated through actions, not just words. And we count on your awareness and determination to take concrete steps to end this tragedy, meaning the genocide. So, that's the call that we're hearing from Palestine. Even if there was no genocide in Gaza, even if there was no Palestine, we would have to be resisting this Trump regime. But there is, on top of everything else, of course, and at the forefront and the foremost, the genocide in Gaza. And we're being called upon, urged by people directly under that boot of US weaponry being, deployed to demolish and destroy, the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Palestinians.
Journalists,
And
health
only,
workers, I mean, they're decimating the whole society.
right, health workers, they massacred, they executed 16 health workers, a week ago. Not to mention the journalists, not to mention everybody in between. Not to mention the fact that there are more child amputees in Gaza than anywhere in the world. Not to mention that just 2 days ago, or was it yesterday, they bombed another house in Gaza and killed 6 more children and all kinds of other people. So, I mean, it's unbearable, of course. It's particularly unbearable for the people that are directly under that. It's even unbearable to know of it, but to not be responding, the way the unions do not respond, to not even reference this call from Palestine, let alone respond to it and take the kind of action that we need and that they need and that we need together. That's what solidarity is all about. It's not simply do-goodism, or morality, although those are good things. But it's the idea that all of our fate as workers and as oppressed people are tied together inextricably, as the Palestinian Trade Union statement says. And that if we don't act together, we are all of us doomed. And yet there's virtually no response, even from the unions, even from the unions that came out for ceasefire and arms embargo. They have not responded to, or even referenced this call. So again, Labor for Palestine is not, does not have major resources. It doesn't have anything like that. But we do have our voice. And we are doing our best to uplift these calls and to bring these issues to our unions and to our workplaces, and to see if on May Day and the events leading up to May Day and beyond May Day, if real action can be taken, including wherever possible, withholding of labor. And it remains to be seen where that can be done. But even for places that it can't be done, there are all kinds of actions that can be taken to show solidarity with Palestine at the workplace, in our unions. And we need to be doing that. We need to be doing that for ourselves, for them above all, and for ourselves, because, as the slogan goes, Palestine will free us all. What that really refers to is that throwing off the yoke of oppression and genocide is liberating for everybody. And we need to be doing our best to support that.
And at the rallies on May Day, and they will be happening around the country, including in San Francisco and Oakland, those trade unions and those union locals can have contingents and raise this issue of Palestine
Absolutely.
and the slopes and these and
Right. I mean, unfortunately, those, to my knowledge, those rallies that are being called by the Chicago teachers unions and others, which is a good thing that they're doing that, but unfortunately, they're not referencing Palestine, even though they're apparently led by folks who are in these ceasefire unions. But the issues are not being connected, even by those who are otherwise raising them in certain places. They're being siloed at best and silenced at worst. So we need to be the ones, as you say, to make sure that we're bringing, not to stand apart and say, well, therefore we'll have nothing to do with these protests. Of course, we should support these protests, but we should also make sure that at these protests, the voice of Palestine is heard in solidarity with Palestine, and demand that Palestine be heard from the platform as well. And if it's not going to be heard from the platform, at least making sure that it's heard from within these contingents that we need to bring.
And people can get a copy, trade unions can get a copy of the resolution from your website, Labor for Palestine.
Yes, yes, laborforpalestine.net. And we're also on Instagram, and all of these things are there. And in fact, there's a sign-on endorsement form there for organizations that want to endorse that statement in support of the Palestinian trade union call.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Michael, for joining us. And I think this is a life and death question for working people, not only in Palestine, but in the United States who face a fascist regime. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks again.